Okay, so what we have done so far, we have looked at the scholars from both the very beginning, well, let's just say from the 9th and 10th century, not really the very beginning, and we compared them with what the scholars are saying today, and we've seen that they don't say the same thing. We've also looked at the historical problems with the Quran and showed that if this had really come from God, he would have not made these many mistakes. And then we went and we looked at what we call source criticism. We looked and saw where so much of the Quran had been borrowed from other sources, and the wrong sources. God would not do something like that, borrow material that is from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and 6th century for that which was already existing, had already been compiled from 1400 BC all the way up until the 1st century AD. God would not make that kind of mistake. Man would, but not God. Now we're getting into some of the more juicy material, and this now goes into what has been happening in the last month, or a little over a month, and we're going to now move into the actual compilations of the Quran. What does history tell us, and what does the tradition tell us? So the traditions, we're going to start with them because we have to go, that's the only thing that Muslims know. That's the only thing you've ever heard. That's the only thing that's ever been taught anywhere, on any school, on any campus, whether it's an undergraduate, postgraduate, you name it. There's only ever been one narrative concerning how the Quran was compiled. And that's in the traditions, the 9th and 10th century traditions. That's all that we are dependent on. But then we're going to go back to here. So let's go ahead and unpack that, and let's go and see what we're talking. Let's get back to this lecture, and then carry it on from there. Okay, so back to the lecture.
Now, to understand how the Quran was put together, you need to go to the Hadith, and you need to go specifically to Al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari is the one that recounts it the best. And when you go to Al-Bukhari, you need to go to volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. There's 509 up on the screen there. You can see it in the Arabic on the right, and you can see the English translation. It's too long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let me just summarize what it says. According to what Al-Bukhari says. Now remember, Al-Bukhari is writing in 870. So this is the late 9th century, writing for that which has happened in 632 to 634. So,
wait, hold on. What did I just say? Al-Bukhari is writing in the late 9th century for that which is happening in 632 to 634. Did you pick that up? See, this is where people aren't looking at it. This is what people haven't really paid attention to. And so I want to spend some time really showing you what I mean. I'm going to put a graph up here. Let's take a look and put this graph up here. All right, now look at this graph. Here you see it's Sahih al-Bukhari. So this is the Bukhari we're talking to. This is the guy that everybody's going to. Take a look where his date on the right of this graph is. He dies in 870, so we can assume that he did his compilations in the last 20 years of his life, between 850 and 870, so to speak. Now, take a look at the left side of the graph, and there you can see where Muhammad dies. This is what the traditions tell us, 632, and where most everybody believes the Quran was compiled, 652. So everything we know about Muhammad's death, about everything that happened during his life, what happened between Mecca and Medina and all the rest, and everything we know about when the Quran was compiled, everything that I'm talking about in this lecture is concerning the first compilation and the second compilation, 632 and 652, where the Quran was finally compiled with Uthman, does not get written there where you see those two arrows are on the left. Not at all, nor in the next century. Can you see the problem? It's not till the next century, the 9th century, the 800s, that we first get the biography doesn't get written until about 830, but this material that's talking about the Quran, which we're dealing with in these lectures, does not get written down to 850 to 870. That's 218 to 238 years too late. Roughly around 220 to 240 years, 220 to 240 years after the fact. Now, that's why you need to look at a graph. Get that in your mind. See that and blaze it in your mind, because everything I'm going to be telling you, everything that Muslims are going to be telling you, comes from that period on the right, for that which is happening in that period on the left. 200 to 240 years too late. So everything that I'm going to be saying now, everything that I'm going to be unpacking now, everything that that we have always known about how the Quran was put together, comes from 200 to 300 years later. In this case, al-Bukhari, 240 years later to round it off. 240 years after the fact, after the time that Muhammad dies. Okay, let's go back to the lecture.
So he's writing about what is happening immediately after Muhammad dies. Muhammad dies in 632. The Quran had not yet been written down. And so Abu Bakr, who is the caliph, along with Umar, who will be the eventual caliph, the two of them have a crisis on their hands. Because many of those who went to the battle in Yamama were killed, and many of those who were killed had memorized the Quran. So they were losing those who had memorized the Quran. And they needed to do something about it, to preserve the Quran. So they call Zaid ibn Thabit. Now, Zaid ibn Thabit is the secretary of Muhammad. They call him in to write the Quran. And he says, no, I can't do something that the Prophet had not done.
Okay, need to stop there because I need to give you some background material. Let's go and put this. Let's go and put exactly what we're talking about. Let's put it up on the screen. So here you go on the screen. Now notice, this is al-Bukhari. This is Sahih Bukhari, volume 6, book 61, Hadith number 509. Look at the top of there. You'll notice I've got underlined in green that is the reference that you need to go to find what we're referring to from the USC-MSA web. That is the old way of looking at al-Bukhari. Today now, you can't find this anymore. In fact, I had to really scour the internet to find this reference, because this is the reference we've been using. This is what I used when I was in seminary. This is what I used when I was at SOAS there in University of London back in the 1990s. But now, you have to go to Dar al-Salam. You see that at the top there, the one above it in green. That reference, and their reference for the same passage there in al-Bukhari is Hadith 4986, book 66, Hadith 8. Completely different categories, completely different numbers. I'm sorry, it's nothing, I can't do anything about that. This has nothing to do with me. This has to do with Muslims today. They have decided to throw away the old reference system called USC-MSA web reference and introduce an entirely new one in just the last 10 or 15 years. So bear with us. I have this problem all the time. Muslims are always coming to me and saying, you don't know what you're talking about. You're making this up. This has nothing to do with al-Bukhari. And they are always getting on my back for it because they can't find it. What's more, there's a whole nother set of al-Bukhari now that's out there that are called the summary or the abridged version, which only has bits and parts of al-Bukhari that are sanitized, only the ones they want you to see. They usually don't have this part. They don't have anything about Muhammad's sexual proclivities. They don't have anything about Muhammad's violence. That has all been taken out, and all you see now is just the abridged version. This is the politically correct version that Muslims are want you to see, and this is the only ones that they know about. And so when you come up with these references, they think we've just put it together. They think we're just making it up. I know David Wood has this problem all the time because he's always putting material like this on screen, and Muslims are screaming and howling and yelling, "You've made it up! This is not true! It doesn't exist!" Well, it does exist. It's right there, and that's why I use the USC MSA, because this is what I've always grown up with. So when I put these up there, I'll put both of them so you can see both of them, just to show you that I'm not making this up. Why would I waste my time making something like this up? So here we are. This is Volume 6, Book 61, Hadith number 509, and that's what I've said in the lecture. When you look at the part that's underlined in red. This is narrated by Zaid ibn Thabit. As I said, he is the secretary of Muhammad, all right? And he is the one that's now been called into Abu Bakr's presence, who is the caliph at that time. We're now between 632 and 634. And there has been a big battle of Yamama. Casualties, as I haven't read there, were heavy among the Qur'an. These are the ones who had memorized it, those who knew the Quran by heart. On the day of the Battle of Yamama, and I'm afraid, Abu Bakr says, that more casualties will take place among the Qur'an in the battlefield, whereby a large part of the Quran may be lost. Therefore, order that the Quran be collected. This is actually, let me back up. This is one of the problems that I've always come up with, because Muslims always come back to me and says, who cares? We don't really care about whether or not it was written down or not. It could be memorized. It was always memorized, and that's all you need was memorization. Well, this should underline that this is a problem right here. If you don't get what's going on here, the fact that this was such a crisis, there in 632 to 634, that we know that the Battle of Yamama, only 70 people were killed. So if 70 people dying caused this much of a crisis, that they had to come together and have it written down, that should tell you something right there, okay? That should tell you something right there. Okay, let's get back to the lecture.
So they say, nonetheless, it's a good thing to do. So he decides to go ahead and do that, and he collects it from palm leaves and white stones and from men's memory. And then one verse, chapter 9, verse 128 to 29, he found with only one man named Abi Kuzaima al-Ansari. So this is known as the first recension. This is the first copy, the first canon of the Quran, written somewhere between 632 and 634, okay? Are you following that? This is Quran number 1.
Okay, let's go put this back up on the screen again so you can see what we're talking about. Now we've come to the next set of red underlines. Now take a look at this. How can you do something which Allah's apostle did not do? This is Zaid ibn Thabit responding to Umar and to Abu Bakr, proving that this had not been done this had not been written down while Muhammad was living. That should show you that pretty clearly. And I know Muslims always come up to me and say, no, it was written down long before Abu Bakr. It was written down while Muhammad was still living. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. According to your own traditions. And remember, you're going to your own traditions back in the 9th century. That's all you have to go on. You don't have anything outside of what we're seeing right here. And here, it's obvious to me that the Quran had not been written down while Muhammad was still living. So, it comes in, he says, Abu Bakr says, he chose Zaid ibn Thabit because you used to write the divine inspiration for Allah's messenger. So you are his secretary. You're the one that's supposed to do that. You are the one that's best suited to do this, is what he's saying. You should search for the fragmentary scripts of the Quran and collect it in one book. He then responds and says, how will you do something which Allah's messenger did not do? He repeats it a second time. That's how serious he's taking it. He's taking this very seriously. Why are you asking me? During the time of the Prophet, he never did this. We never did this. I'm his secretary, but we never did this. In other words, he finally relented, so he started looking for the Quran and collecting it from what was written. That means palm stalks and white stones, and also from men who knew it best by heart. That means men who had memorized it, the Qur'an that it talks about. And then the completed copy, the completed manuscript of the Quran, remained first with Abu Bakr, so he gave it to Abu Bakr. When Abu Bakr died, that then went to Umar, the second caliph, and then when he died, or he was killed actually, then it was given to Hafsa, his daughter, who is also the wife, of Muhammad, who is also the wife of Muhammad. And as I said there on stage, according to tradition, not these ones here, but other traditions, she then kept it under her bed for 20 years. Okay, back then to the lecture.
According to tradition, not according to al-Bukhari, that Quran then is given to Hafsa, one of the wives of Muhammad, and she puts it under her bed and leaves it there. Roughly 20 years later, then we get to volume 6, hadith number 510, the very next page. So we've jumped 20 years. Now we're roughly around 652. Are you following me? We were in 632, now we're in 652. In 652, Uthman now is caliph. Abu Bakr and Umar have both died. Uthman has another crisis on his hand. And he calls Zaid ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad, once again, a second time, to rewrite the Quran, which was given to Hafsa, to take Hafsa's Quran, that original one, and to rewrite it. And he was given 3 men to help him out: Alas, Zubair, and Hisham. The 4 of them were then to rewrite it again. And if they had any disagreement, they were to write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Now, does anybody here speak Arabic or read or write Arabic? Okay, what's wrong with that right there? What is wrong? How do you write it in a Qurayshi dialect? What's a dialect? How do you find dialectical differences in an Arabic text? Okay, but how do you write it down differently? Hearing, yes, but how would you write what you hear is different. So if you were from Iraq, you have one dialect. If you're from Morocco, you would have another dialect. Am I correct? 2 different dialects. How would you then write that so people could see that it's different? What would you need for that to happen? Okay, let me rephrase this. What is it that you recognize in the text that creates the dialect? You need the dhamma, the kasra, and the fatha. Am I correct? the vowels, because these are all vowels difference. And you also need diacritical marks, the dottings. Am I correct? Were there any dots, for those of you who speak Arabic, were there any dots in the 7th century? No. Dots were not invented until the 8th century. We're going to see that a little later. Were there any vowels in the 7th century? So how in the world does this make any sense to you? Why has no one noticed this before? We've noticed it. Al-Fadi, who I work with from Saudi Arabia, who's doing his doctorate in this area, has noticed it because he speaks fluent Arabic and he understands exactly the problem with this. He says you cannot have dialectical differences in a written text in the 7th century. But then who's writing this? Al-Bukhari is writing this, and he's writing this in 870. That's the late 9th century. In the 9th century, that makes sense. He's just writing what he thought was the problem, and he's redacting it back onto an era that he didn't even understand, because he did not look at the earliest manuscripts. None of the earliest manuscripts have any dots, and they don't have any vowelization. Now, that's just for you two, okay? For the rest of you who have no idea what I've just said, don't worry, you'll get it as we go on.
Okay, and this is a problem, I think, that mainly happens with people, well, the people who understand Arabic better know this. And for most of you who are listening to me, you probably, and I'm not an Arabist myself, but I learned this when I took Arabic. And one of the first things you do know is that you need to have vowels, dama, the kasra, the fatha, and we're going to go into that later on in another video, so I'm not going to get into it in detail right now. But just to say that we do know that these did not exist in the 7th century, and you look at the earliest manuscripts, they do not have dots, they do not have vowels. Those are added in the late 8th century, 9th century, and on. So this is something that would not have existed in the 7th century, mid-7th century, the 652 that we're talking about here. That's all I'm saying. Now, be careful. We are hearing that there may be some dots, a few dots that were starting to be introduced in the 7th century, but not the manuscripts we're looking at, not the earliest manuscripts. And we don't have any manuscript from the time of Uthman, so there's no way of knowing that. What we do know is the whole means of delineating dialects would have come much, much, much later. Okay, let's continue on with the lecture.
Now, here's what's fascinating. According to the 510, once they had written this final text in the Qurayshi dialect, which is impossible to use, they then take one copy and send it to every province. So how many provinces existed at the time of Uthman in 652? 9 provinces. I'll show you that a little later. And when you look at those 9 provinces, you will see that means there should be 9 original Qur'ans in existence today. When I was doing my master's and my doctoral material on this, I was always told it was only 4: Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, and Medina. But it looks like there were 9 of these. Why hadn't anybody noticed this before? And then all the other manuscripts that existed that disagreed with this final text were burnt. Why would you burn manuscripts, folks? Unless, of course, you want to destroy the evidence. Ask your Muslim friends, why in the world did Uthman burn all the other manuscripts? It's right there in Al-Bukhari. They can't walk away from this. They cannot. I've yet to, in 35 years of asking this question, I've heard a Muslim that can really give me an answer to that.
Okay, so let's put back up on the screen again what we're talking about. This is now Volume 6, Book 61, Hadith number 510, and you can see this time it's narrated by Anas ibn Malik. And you have this man, Hudayfa ibn al-Yamam. Hudayfa comes to Uthman in 652 now, so we're 20 years later, and he's really upset because these people in Shams and Iraq. Shams and Iraq. What is Shams? Shams would be Syria today, and Iraq. So that's much, much further north. These are the people in Shams in Iraq. They are reciting it differently. See, these people in Shams and Iraq, they have different recitation. So and this is what Shabir Ali has brought up in his videos that he did on May 19th, earlier this year, about a month and a half ago. And he said very clearly that this is nothing more than dialectical difference. So something's wrong with the dialect in Syria and Iraq that's very, very different than that which they speak in the central part of Arabia. And that is very clear, because look what he says. He then has Zaid ibn Thabit, the same fellow that had written the remember the one before, the one that back at the time of Abu Bakr, he brings him out, the same guy, and he asks him to get Hafsa's copy. That's the copy that had been written 20 years earlier. And he asks him to come along with 3 others. And you can see I've got them underlined. A fellow named Abdullah ibn al-Zubair, Saad ibn al-As, and a fellow named Abdurrahman bin Harith bin Hisham. 4 of them, therefore, were to write it in what? They are to write it in the Qurayshi dialect if they have any dispute. So that's very clear. You're not to put it into the Iraqi dialect. You're not to put it into the people from Shams, from Syria. So do not take the dialect that's up north. You're to use this dialect, Qurayshi, and only this dialect. That's hugely important. Not in this lecture, but you're going to see later on. That's enormously important because we're going to find out what is the dialect they finally did choose, which is the Quran they're using today. And it is not from the Qurayshi dialect. Okay, so that's important because I'm just now reiterating what the traditions say. So once he does that, and Zaid ibn Thabit along with these 3 friends then do that, he then gives it to Uthman, and then Uthman sends it out to these different provinces. Now, traditionally speaking, most people think it's just 4 cities. One was left in Medina, one was sent to Basra, one was sent to Baghdad, Kufa or Baghdad, right there in northern Iraq, or central Iraq, and then one was sent way up to Damascus. So, Medina, Basra, Baghdad, and one is in Damascus. But we're finding out if it's every province, if you're going to go by what the tradition say, you need to look at the provinces. And we've looked and seen how many provinces there were, and there were actually 9 provinces. So it could be anywhere from 4 to 9. I'm not going to sit there and make a huge big thing of this, but I'm just suggesting 4 to 9. In not what we do know anyhow, there were at least 4 Qur'ans, final Qur'ans, complete Qur'ans at the time of Uthman. Getting that? I'm really emphasizing that because that's going to become hugely important once we get into the manuscript material, which is going to be in a few lectures from now. Okay, so let's get back then to this talk, and let's now see what my problems are, because I'm going to come up with some of the problems that I have here. Okay?
So here are my problems, and these are the problems I have with those 2 first compilations, one in 632 and the one in 652. Concerning, let's start with the one in 632, 6509. First and foremost, my first question is, why in the world, if God in his wisdom was going to give the final revelation that's going to supersede all the previous revelations, why in the world did he use a language that could not even accommodate it? When he already had Hebrew and Greek in his earliest revelations, why in the world does he turn around and use a completely new language which had no diacritical marks, had no vowelization? You can't even read it or understand it. Why in the world would he choose that? Secondly, why would he give his greatest revelation in the history of mankind to a man who couldn't even read and write? Listen, Muhammad, though he knew Arabic quite well, he was his native tongue, he had 22 years to read and write it. Those of you who know Arabic, there are only 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. You're going to see them later tonight. I learned the Arabic alphabet in 2 weeks. I didn't know how to speak Arabic, but Muhammad did. Why in 22 years could he not learn to read and write? What's more, he had a secretary, Zaid ibn Thabit. What was the job of a secretary if it is not to write down what the master is saying? Am I correct? So why didn't Zaid ibn Thabit write this down? He had 22 years to do so. Then why did Abu Bakr not make copies immediately of Hafsa's text? Let's continue on. Muslims said that thousands died at the Battle of Yamama. According to the traditions, there was only 70 that died at the Battle of Yamama. Doesn't this prove that there were very few who actually knew the Quran at that time, if only 70 knew it? Doesn't this also prove that there was a real crisis with the Quran? Because if this was the case, if this was such a crisis that with 70 dying, then when I hear Muslims say it didn't matter if they were all killed because people had memorized it, obviously this was a much greater problem. The fact that they had to write it down means they could not trust people's memory. And I can understand that because I don't trust people's memory today. Yeah. So this proves to me that memorization wasn't good enough to preserve the Quran. When Muslims tell me that all the time, I just point them right back to the Battle of Yamama and say, you've got a problem here, because Abu Bakr and Umar realized that they needed to write it down. When we get to 510 then, How could there be dialectical differences in the mid-7th century? Because in order to have dialectical differences, you have to have vowelization. You have to have diacritical marks. They didn't even exist. They were yet to exist for 100 years, and the vowelization would not to exist for another 200 years. And then why in the world did Uthman burn it, for heaven's sakes? Doesn't this suggest that they didn't agree? Why didn't he preserve so we can look and see which ones they did disagree, so we can see where the disagreements were? Then let's look at the 9 cities, and here they are. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, and Nishapur. Went too fast. Those are the 9 cities. Now take a look at those 9 cities. Except for Jerusalem, all of those 9 cities still exist under Islamic control. Am I correct? And for 1,400 years, they have been under Islamic control. I don't recall of any floods. I don't recall of any damage. I don't recall of any conquest. I don't recall of any fires that would have destroyed those manuscripts. So why is it that if they were sent to 9 different cities, why is it we can't find one of those 9 earliest manuscripts? Not one. Not one exists today. Either that's ineptitude on a grand scale, or they never existed to begin with. I think after tonight, you'll see it's the latter. But let's continue on. Number 6, the fact that Zaid ibn Thabit came up with Surah 33:23 with just one man, Zaid ibn Thabit al-Ansari, proves the Quran wasn't even complete in 632. Could there have been many other surahs that he missed? What about the material which was lost with those killed in the Battle of Yamama? If there was a second Quran in 652, why now do we have up to at least 32 Qurans in existence today, all in Arabic?
Well, I think you know where I'm going to today from what you're seeing there on the lecture. And there's not too much more that needs to be said, because I think the damage is already there. The fact that with just these first 2 Qurans, we are talking about different Qurans. We're talking about some internal contradictions. We're talking about some real problems. I did want to go back, though, to this whole situation about recitation. If recitation was that good, as I'm hearing Muslims say all the time, and memorization was that great, as they are saying even today, people can memorize the entire Quran. Understood. The reason you can memorize the entire Quran is because you have something to memorize. You have a text in front of you. You don't just memorize what other people say, because depending on who's saying what, you can get many different versions. We know that with Chinese whispers. Sorry for anybody who's Chinese, but that what you do in birthday parties, you can start saying something in some person's ear, and they say to another person, they say to another person. By the time it gets to 15 people later, it's a completely different thing than what you started with. If that can happen within a period of 15 minutes with 15 different people, you can then understand what would happen over a period of 200 years of memorization. So there is a difficulty here. There is a real difficulty here with the problem memorization. More than that, if memorization was that great, then why did they even need to write it down? Why was this crisis in the very beginning? And secondly, if memorization was that great, then what's the purpose of burning manuscripts? More than that, burning manuscripts are a material thing. Burning manuscripts means these were actually written down. My good friend Shabirari always goes on and saying that the whole difficulty why they even have to write a final recension from that which is the beginning is because there were so many different recitations, all coming from the north, all coming from Shams and Iraq. Recitations are coming out of the mouth. Then if there's all these different recitations, why are you burning manuscripts? You do not burn people's tongues. You do not burn their mouths. You can't burn recitations. Obviously, those recitations had to have been written down, evidently. And if they did not have diacritical marks and they didn't have any vowelization, then these were razm texts. These were skeletal texts. These were consonantal texts, because that's what they had back then. We're going to see that when we get to the manuscript material. These were consonantal texts that were appearing differently than what was given to Hafsa, than what was existing back there in 632. In 652, 20 years later, it looked like there were many different Qur'ans that did not agree. That's why you have to burn Qur'ans. You dispel and you eradicate the evidence. Dear. Remember, just one other thing before I go on. I did talk about the fact, why is it Muhammad could not have memorized this, because Arabic only has 28 letters. I stopped to think, they didn't have 28 letters. If you don't, 28 letters is with all the diacritical marks in place. If you look at the consonantal texts, they really only had, and what I've been told, and this is something that has been told me by other Arab experts, that in the 7th century they only had 16 letters. With the addition of the diacritical marks, then you get the other 12 that come afterwards to make it 28. So you can see, if this is the case, then he even had less letters. He had less and an easier time to have learned how to read and write. Nonetheless, all of these come together to show us that there were some real problems at the very beginning, and these are things that Muslims have not taken into consideration. We are, and we're asking these questions, and these are legitimate questions. They didn't even have a complete first Quran, because you can see twice in both places, in both of these renditions, both of Abu Bakr and Uthman, Zaid ibn Thabit found one reference that he didn't find with anybody else except with one man. And then when he gets to the time of Uthman, he still finds another one that he hadn't heard about. Well, what about all those who had died? Did they also die with other verses, with other surahs in their heads at the Battle of Yamal? So, it just gets better and better. We're starting to get into the juicy material now. We're starting to get into much more damaging material on the historical problems with the Quran. God be with you. It's been good having this time. Now we'll continue on. We'll start going into some of the most exciting, and this is coming up to that which we've been talking about in this last month, and that is the diacritical variants. Okay, until then, this is Jathan. Over and out.